Hi students, welcome to checkpoint 2 of your unit. These video directions are going to give you an example of how to annotate your origin or your trickster story. For some of you guys, I know you're doing this unit very early on in the school year, and so you still might be getting used to annotations and how to analyze using literary devices. One thing that I want to first explain to you is the difference between literary devices, rhetorical devices, and satirical devices. And I'll explain this in many videos because it's an important distinction to understand. So in this checkpoint, I'm asking for you to complete a literary analysis. When you do that, you use literary devices to analyze how the author creates an artistic purpose. They're trying to create an emotion in their reader or evoke an emotion in their reader. They're trying to create a message and an image in your mind. And so literary devices tend to work towards an artistic purpose. In contrast, if I was asking you to do a rhetorical analysis using rhetorical devices, you would be analyzing how the author uses the rhetorical devices to persuade their reader, to convince them of an idea, or to convince them to do something. So notice how the purposes are different. Literary devices creates a message, creates an emotion, creates an image, while rhetorical devices persuade to change someone's mind to do something. Then you have satirical devices, and you can do a satirical analysis using them. The purpose of satire is to create humor, but also to ridicule something that the author believes is worthy of that ridicule. And therefore, again, we have a different purpose. So for this one, I'm asking you to do a literary analysis, and I'm going to go through an example to show you what that would actually look like. And then you'll go and you'll do your own. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my presentation. All right, so let's focus on the origin and trickster stories. So we're going to look at an example called A Satisfying Meal, and we're going to analyze how these various devices work in this trickster story. And so essentially I'm going to demonstrate what you might do for your own trickster or origin story that you select. All right, so to start with, we're going to look at the syntax of the piece and how that creates tone. So first off, where is it? Well, it's throughout the entire piece. Syntax is sentence structure, and so every single sentence has syntax because it's a sentence. And so what I wanted to point out are just some key moments where we see he killed it, he said, and then Fox woke up. These are very simple sentences, and the sentences in their simplicity create this tone of the trickster story, the idea that it's using very simple, almost childlike stories, utilizing animals almost like a fable in order to teach a very important life lesson. So life can be complicated and teaching life lessons can be hard, and so the authors are purposefully creating very simple scenarios to try to communicate very complex life lessons, and therefore the simple syntax aids in the simplicity of the story. They don't want to confuse their readers, or in this case it was usually an audience listening. They don't want to confuse their audience, they want to inform their audience, and so they're making this very accessible through simple syntax. Now there are some more complex sentences such as not far away, coyote came along scrounging for something to eat, sniffing around, and we see that there's a building of image upon image in this sentence. However, those type of sentences are going to be much more rare because the speaker doesn't want to overwhelm their audience. And so notice how with this syntax, I identify where it is, I identify how it works, simple sentences primarily with some kind of building sentences, and then I explain why. One, because this is usually told orally, and so it needs to be more simple. And two, because the goal is to inform the audience in a very kind of accessible way so that they can learn about an important life lesson. So I go through my where, how, and why in analyzing the syntax of this piece. So now let's move on to the diction of the writing, which also creates tone. And again, just like syntax, diction is throughout. Diction is word choice, and this is made up of words, and therefore every single word is an aspect of diction. I did want to point out a couple that I thought were worthy diction moments, and so we see words such as fond, good, and so these are very simple words. Good is about as simple as it gets. Fond is slightly more elevated in diction, but it's still a very small word. It's a very accessible word, and this goes along with kind of what we said about syntax. There's not very complex words in here. There's no words that are going to confuse us, and that's because the point is not to confuse the audience. It's actually to do the opposite. It's to enlighten them, and therefore the author wants to be as accessible as possible. And this is reinforced, for instance, here by the repetition of this very simple language. Remember it, remember it. It's emphasizing the fact that the fox has been tricked, and he doesn't remember it because it never happened. And so we have this very simplistic diction, the repetition of important moments, so that upon a first listen, the audience can grasp the story and the meaning of it. Also, I wanted to point out the phrasing, or the word competing, and also the word trick. This emphasizes the fact that it's a trickster story at the very beginning, so that we know which kind of story we are encountering. And so that's also quite important for the diction. And so again, I took us through the where, the how, and the why with the diction. Let's talk about imagery. So imagery also comes down to specific words, but with diction, while diction creates tone, the purpose of the imagery is to appeal to our senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And so when we look at this, the instances where they occur of imagery are tasty meal, hot ashes, still glowing embers, very tender, fat and smeared, greasy. So all of these are textural. They have to do with touch, the heat, the texture of it, and also kind of implies kind of how it might taste. And notice that all of this imagery is going towards one thing, the meal that has been cooked, because that's the most important part of the trick. The trick that the coyote is playing on the fox is that he steals his food without the fox even realizing it. And so how this is working is all of these apply to the food. Why does the author do that? It's because the food is meant to become enticing. The audience is like, oh, that sounds so delicious. And that way, when the coyote takes it from the fox, the audience would go, oh, they took his delicious meal. And then when the fox doesn't realize that his delicious meal has been stolen, the audience is like, oh, fox, you foolish fox, how could you not know this delicious meal has been taken from you? And so the imagery, the purpose of it is to make the audience kind of be able to imagine how good this meal might be, so that they kind of chuckle over the trick that is then played on the fox. So let's go look at how we might analyze alliteration. So you guys have been possibly taught in the past that alliteration has to be words right next to each other. That's actually not true. They just have to be in the same vicinity as each other. So here we see alliteration with scrounging, something, sniffing, smelling. And so with all those words, scrounging, sniffing, smelling, the purpose, so how that works is that they all start with this S sound, and therefore they're linked together as somehow having a similar purpose. And why does the author do that? It emphasizes the coyote's discovery of the delicious meal that's being emphasized through imagery. So the coyote scrounges for the meal, he sniffs for the meal, he smells the meal. Notice how all of these S words are doing the same thing. They emphasize it, the coyote's discovery of the delicious food. And so we see here how these devices are working in order to emphasize certain parts of the story, and they're working together in order to make the whole story have a great deal more of meaning to it than maybe we initially thought. I mean, when we first read this, we probably think, oh, this is so simple, there's probably very little going on. But now we realize that it's actually a very complex piece with a lot of thought put behind it, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's talk about personification. It just happens in one place when it says the wind brought to him a scent of roasted meat. And so personification is when you give an inanimate object, an abstract concept, or an animal, you treat it like a human. And so here the wind is bringing the scent to the coyote. And this personification is important because it seems as though the wind is on Coyote's side. So the wind is kind of giving Coyote like a wink, like, oh, here, let's play a trick on the fox. And so here it just kind of adds to the humor of it, where it seems as though Coyote and the wind are working together to trick the fox, and it adds to the humor. So that's the why. One thing I wanted to point out is sometimes students say, oh, well, the whole thing's personification because the coyote and the fox are talking and cooking and doing things like that. That's actually not personification. That's what we call anthropomorphism. So when you're reading something that's a fable, essentially, in this case, a trickster story, where animals are actually full on out acting like humans, having conversations and building houses and stuff like that, that's not personification. Personification is more localized instances such as the wind brought him. Anthropomorphism is when the whole story treats animals like humans. So make sure not to mix those up. All right, let's check out the anaphra. So anaphra is when you start consecutive sentences with the same word. So we see it here with he dug, he ate, he said, he left, he took. And so all of these sentences start with the word he. And so that's how it works. Why does the author do this? So the author does this in order to emphasize all the things the coyote is doing. We can see every moment, every step of the trick that he plays on the fox. And it takes us as the audience along step by step where we can kind of chuckle along with him and say, look what that coyote's doing to our poor fox. And so it breaks down the steps, again, in a very accessible way. That goes back to what we talked about with diction and syntax. But it also kind of builds the humor where we see step by step just how Coyote's going to get away with this. And so when it ends with Coyote going off laughing, we might be chuckling along with him as his tricks have been emphasized by the anaphra. Let's talk about the dramatic irony at the end. This is our last device. So at the very end, the fox wakes up and he is successfully tricked by the coyote. He says, I don't remember eating this, but I must have. The grease is on my mouth. The bones are here on the ground. Osy wellsies, I'm sure it was good. And so the dramatic irony is that the fox has been tricked, but we, the audience, knows what really happened. So remember, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that a character in a story does not. And so the purpose of this dramatic irony is that it's really where the humor comes from. The fact that the fox never will know, like he has no idea. He won't even get mad at the coyote because he doesn't know what the coyote's done. That's really where the humor comes from, where we shake our head at the foolishness of the fox. And that brings us, actually this is our last one, and that brings us into the allegory, which is ultimately kind of the same purpose as all trickster allegories. So allegory is when you have a story that has a meaning intended for the real world. So here we have this little trickster story, this fable about the fox being tricked, but it teaches us the lesson of don't be tricked. If something weird happens, maybe you should ask yourself why that's happened. Don't let yourself be deceived. And so all of these play into the allegorical message of Don't let yourself be made a fool of. And that is how all of this works together. So hopefully, kind of seeing this demonstrated will assist you in completing your own annotations for either the origin or the trickster stories. All right, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.